Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to this NAV Skills webinar. Today we are going to do an RDLC refresher. I am very happy to have Dave Machanick with us. Dave happily volunteered when I asked for people to present webinars, and RDLC is something that we have not discussed, or we never had a webinar on it, so I'm very happy to have Dave with me today. So before I give the floor to Dave, basically what we're going to do is we're going to go over tips and tricks. We are going to expect that you have basic familiarity with RDLC. So we do expect that you know how to open the report designer in Visual Studio, that you know what an NAV dataset is, and basically what Dave is going to do is just going to go over things that people forget, that people don't do in a smart way, and he's going to use a Word document to do that, and the Word document will be available for download after the webinar. So with that, I'm going to give the floor to Dave. Dave, you are a presenter and should be able to share your screen.
Thanks, Mark. You seeing my Word document?
Yes, everything is clear.
All right. I have a lot of points that I'm going to be going over, so I'm going to try and keep up a good pace. And this is still fairly basic, so I hope that someone who is still fairly new can get something out of it, as well as being a refresher for people who use the product a lot. So first of all, with Visual Studio, you always want to use the document outline because that shows you the different fields that are associated with the document. And you can also undock it so you can see it easily. So here,
how do I get that, Dave? How do I get the document outline?
Well, what I do is I go to File, hang on, View, Other Windows, Document Outline. And then, so I can see at the same time I undock it on this screen for visibility. I'm not showing you all the pieces, but when you undock it, it just means if you have a nice big screen, high resolution, or two screens, you can see your document outline, and when you click on something, it'll bring that up on your report. And then once you click on it, then the ability to click on the property pages and basically change the fields or set the values, alignments, fonts, and so on.
And this basically saves you from going into the visual report, but you can just find the fields in kind of the same XML structure as you have in NAV, so you don't have to go into these expressions.
Right, because basically over here, sometimes they name the fields, like you can see in the properties box, it's called Vatno text. Sometimes the fields are just called TXT 103, which is meaningless.
And this is just easier to find fields. So customer says, can you just change the VAT text to a different font, and then you use the document outline to find the field.
That's correct.
Cool.
And this is now a lot of the reports that were converted over from NAV 2009 are kind of what I call not very pretty. And 206, and the reason I'm showing this one, it's common for all the editions since Worldwide Report. It has the good, the bad, and the ugly. The customer address box contains a kitchen sink of all the other fields with data that have meaningful text name. And let's see if I can find that again. Problem is showing everything at the same time here. So let's have a look at the customer address box. You'll probably have to edit this a bit.
Sure, no problem. I can do that.
I do have a question since you're editing this out. Have you found any good way of showing more information so people can actually see it at the same time?
What is the resolution that you're using right now?
I think it's 800 by 600. Rick said if I didn't have a low resolution, you couldn't see it.
No, I think you can just switch to one bigger. This is too small.
All right.
I mean, this is even more confusing. So let's just switch to something bigger.
I have a 1024 by 768, so 1152. If I do that, then that's still pretty readable. The next setting would be.
This is fine. This is fine.
All right.
If this makes the I think the Visual Studio will be a lot clearer when we do this.
Okay. Because one of the problems is okay. Here's the customer address box.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the customer address box, by clicking on the document outline, it then shows the property. I can now bring up the property box. And one trick they had to do when they moved to 2013 and above is because they wouldn't calculate the fields, they ended up putting it in the visibility box. So when I want to find the field it's referring to, I then have to go to the number.
Yeah, this is the get header and set header thing, right?
Right, this is the get header and set header. And you can get away from that to a certain extent, and I'll cover that later. But since a lot of the reports come with the get header and set header, it's important to know where it is, where it is, and how to manipulate it.
Yeah, and maybe for those who are listening in and don't know why get header and set header is there, but it's basically especially for Europe. If you have invoices in different languages, it's the only way to make the language switch in between invoices. It's less important probably in North America, but in Europe it's really important.
Right, because basically it gets multi-language and we'll bring that over. Now 10.4.11 was another example I had, and that is a North American check, and that one is, even with some of their fixes, it's very hard to follow. So let me.
And does the document outline help you with that report?
It does. Fortunately, they've got rid of some of the worst abuses. Because at one point they had fields on top of fields, and when you do that, then you're trying to figure out, okay, which one of these is it actually using. Now, at least in the newer versions, they've consolidated it to where you just have one field, and they're using the properties to decide what.
Yeah, it's very interesting to know that a lot of the reports in NAV actually even originated back from the DOS version, and they were converted first from DOS to Windows, and then when RDLC came out, they were converted to RDLC, and Microsoft even themselves were learning as they were going. So you can really see that there is no consistent line in all the reports. That's basically what you're referring to, right?
That's right. Like for example, this property box is called text box 112. So the only way to, if you don't have the physical form in front of you, you have to bring up the expression, which tells you it's number 92 of the foot info. Then you have to go to the foot info and see what number 92 is. So it's always a good idea if you're doing a report to give your text boxes names. That way you know that what the field's meant to contain.
Yeah, I always tell people that naming stuff is good, right? I mean, if you go to a zoo with your kids and the animals won't have names, how can you communicate about animals if you don't give them names? And it's the same in software. If you just call everything text, then how can you differentiate between stuff? That's what naming is useful for.
Right. And Visual Studio is basically an extra layer that Nav has for reporting. So in effect, you're having to do some additional work in order to use it, but at the same time, it's worth doing properly so you have something that people can follow.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the other things that I have to do quite often is basically I go tools, options. If it's not coming up with line numbers, then basically I come to languages and I enable the line numbers. That way when I'm pulling up the box with all the code, it's not just one big jumble of words. I actually have line numbers associated with each variable.
And then you can just see by the line number which field it is.
That's right. Because if you're choosing 92, you don't want to have to count them. So by putting the line numbers in, if you don't have that enabled, come over here and enable it. So once again, you do tools,
yeah.
Options.
Yeah.
And
then
you
can copy and paste it to Excel as well, but this is easier.
Right. I mean, that's what I was doing until I found out about this.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, so this way here, it keeps the numbers for you. So just remember tools, options, text editor general, and check your line numbers.
And can you just quickly show where the line numbers show up?
Sure. So basically over here, this one I showed earlier, visibility, I click over here, and the line numbers show up over here.
Yeah, exactly. And this is not by default. This is only if you do the switch.
That's right. I've found when I installed 2015 it was there, and I don't know if that's because it was reading my settings from Visual Studio 2013.
Probably, yeah. I've never seen it, so it must be.
Right. I found for every new computer I get on, and I end up using quite a few, I need to set this.
Yep.
But it reduces your work quite dramatically if it's here already instead of having to copy paste Excel every time. I'm sorry about dragging this back and forth. I'm just limited to how much I can show at a time.
Sure.
And over here, I give you the diagram of how you get to it.
Yeah, and people can download the Word document anyway. So we'll put the link to the Word document in the YouTube comments, so people can just look at the YouTube comments and then download the Word file.
Okay. Now, there's not a wizard for report development in the way that we'd like to have a wizard, but there's kind of a, I'd call it a wizard light. There's an initial template that comes with nav called report.rdlc, and that contains basically the code to do blank zeros and so on. You can update your initial, that template and replace it. You can either do one template fits all, and you can see an example that that Klaus Landstrom posted, or you could basically do one template for each type. So if you want to set up a template, then basically you just bring up Visual Studio.
Yeah, and I think I have a link to Klaus's templates. Mm-hmm. So I will also put a link to Klaus's templates in the YouTube command line.
Right, and I gave you my objects for the ones that I did.
Yeah.
I think that way people have a choice. You want everything there, or you want to do one that's specifically tailored. So basically, when we do our nav, actually that was the wrong one, sorry. You have report layout. So under the role-tailored client, you have report layout. Let's see. You probably should skip that one.
I can edit it out, don't worry.
All right, but basically you have a report layout. You bring up the RDLC. Let's just shut that one down.
There we go. There we have report.rdlc. And that's the default RDLC report that you get when you create a new report.
That's
so everything
right.
everything that you put in this file you get for free for every report that you create.
That's
so
right.
if your company has all the reports with a pink background and a blue italic curly font, then this is where you set that stuff.
That's right, and you can basically have multiple copies and just copy in the one you need when you need it. And if you have multiple report layouts up at the same time, when you create a new report, it'll pick up whatever is there in the version that you're doing. So that you could do a new report, keep it up, bring up, copy another one in, do another new report, and it will basically bring this up for you.
Good.
And so basically, one approach is to just do a template per report style and do it that way. And I give you the location here. Next thing is grouping. That's something that people sometimes struggle with.
Oh yeah, me too.
So let me bring up a sample report that I did. A 50,010. So basically did a very simple report here. Balance summary, I do my view, layout. Oh, and the other thing, let me point out, a lot of the Microsoft Converter reports do not include caption. Now, the beauty behind including the caption is instead of passed as a field that's repeated on every row set, it's passed as a parameter. So that means all these names are just put out there one time, and when you look at the data set, you don't actually see that, which I'll show you when we do the data set. But that does, remember, every time you're doing a report, you're generating data, and it's being passed to the RTC client. So by minimizing the information you pass, the quick report's going to go over, especially if it's a big report.
Oh yeah, that's how performance problems start.
Right. So let's bring up the layout. Okay, so for grouping, you notice I have a section called row groups. And one of the things I can do here is get advanced mode, which I'll cover the importance of in a little bit. But basically, in your Tablix properties, you always have to put the dataset result. Now, Microsoft reporting with Visual Studio and Nav only supports one data set, but you do have to fill it in. So let's see. And so once I have that in place, now I can come down, because first of all, one of the things you have to do is if you want to repeat a new page, those prompts, nice prompts it gives you about repeating a new page don't work unless you're on 2009, Mark's favorite release. So what you have to do is after you've got into your advanced mode, you then have to click on your static line and tell it you want to repeat the headings. Now, so basically you have to expand this area here in order to see it. So and then once you've expanded that, you now have repeat a new page true. Now there's one little gotcha. If you have two heading lines and you only want the second line to repeat but not the first, it won't work. Because basically, if you repeat the first line, you're allowed to repeat the second line, but you're not vice versa. But if you want to repeat your headings in every page, this is where you do that by expanding this area into advanced mode and clicking on the static line that contains the headings. And it's the group. Here I'm grouping on the bill to customer number. So that means I'm specifically doing by bill to customer number, and I'm also sorting of the bill to customer number. That because I'm planning to do a report that prints one or more pages for a bill to customer and then repeats on another page. If you don't have your sorting right, you might think, well, I've got it sorted in Nav. Well, Visual Studio doesn't know about it. You may not get the result. You won't get the results you want. Visual Studio is basically getting a data set from you, and it's going to sort it however you tell it to sort it.
Yeah, so the sorting in the NAV dataset is not that important anymore.
No. And basically, you're passing let me just pull that out of the way. So basically, you're passing a data set. It can contain any data you want. It doesn't have to come from the table. You could give it a variable or calculate a field. It really doesn't care, because once it gets to Visual Studio, all it's getting is a set of rows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you also have the reset page number option, which is important if you want to start each group with its own page number. So if I want that, I'd go to page break and reset page number true. This is important for invoices.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're printing a batch of invoices, you want each new invoice start page 1, or if you're printing a salesperson report, you may want to split it up by salesperson and start it with page 1. So each salesman gets a report that's specifically for them. And that's where you do it here, reset page number. And this is a feature, I think was added in 2013, Visual Studio 2013. So Nav basically supports Visual Studio 12, 13, and 15. Typically, it's whatever Visual Studio was available at the time of release and back a few versions. And what that's good for too is when I pick my page numbers, my built-in fields are page number, but then I also have overall page number.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that usually I'm just going to use page number. If for any reason I want to support both, I have my overall page number. And you can also pass your user ID of the person who ran it, which is useful. And also one other thing that I'd mention, for those of us used to Nav, the double quotes get used in RDLC. It does not like single quotes.
Yep. And you're using the N sign rather than the plus sign to concatenate strings.
Right. All right, so use group headers for group info and not page headers as in the above report. And the reason I prefer to use a group header is, first of all, I can force a group header to print on a new page by using a repeat on new page. And it also gets away from having used get data and set data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big thing. That's really a big difference.
Now, I've noticed some of the newer versions of Nav reports have started using first and last. Things like company name can be put in the header and footer by specifying I want the first and the last. Mm-hmm. So the advantage there is you're avoiding get data and set data.
Yeah, but you can't do that with the address information and all of that stuff.
No, nothing variable. So anything variable, if you want it in the page header or page footer, has to be get data, set data. That's why, if at all possible, use the group headers and group footers. Integer table, you actually are a lot of examples where Nav uses the integer table. You'd have to control the number of occurrences unless you want to see it repeated, what, 32 billion times? So generally you'd either set a range or the number of iterations to control how many records you want for the integer tables. And
So, Dave, I was actually curious. In NAV 2015, Microsoft introduced a new property that a data item in a report can be a temporary data item. Doesn't that, in your opinion, make the integer table reports a little bit obsolete?
it does a little bit. It's still useful if you want to use nav queries.
Mm-hmm.
Because
yeah.
And the advantage of your nav query is that unlike everything else you do in nav, it actually returns only the fields that you're querying.
Yeah,
and because
exactly.
it uses nav business logic, you avoid the overhead of SQL Server where you're trying to figure out what conditions you want to use in order to calculate the sum. The nav query does that for you automatically, and it seems to execute about as fast as a SQL query.
Mm-hmm.
I think I mentioned there's a 2 gig data limit on the data set sent for port viewer. You send too much data and you wait for minutes and receive an error. Yeah. And the same limit also applies to your nav temp table.
And this happens every now and then because Microsoft puts the image 3 times in a data set of the sales invoice, right?
Right. I've have one trick to get around that if the image varies, which I'll cover in a little bit. But basically, you don't want to repeat images. If you basically use the first field, you can retrieve the image that way. The other alternative is to clear out the data set in the second row,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not repeated.
Yeah.
But as I said, don't send your repeat images and don't send data that be printed in detail. Do the summarization in nav. And there was a particularly bad example that finally Microsoft fixed was the inventory evaluation that was the North American edition. Basically, if someone had a lot of ledger entries, it would crash the report.
Mm-hmm.
And that was because they were doing the summary in the RDLC like they used to do in the classic client.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference with classic client is it processes a record at a time, whereas the RDLC is basically a separate animal that's being passed a data set. And it actually passes the whole data set, which is why things will crash if you make them too large.
Yep.
And if you need a group trailer printed at the bottom of the page, you can either count rows or feed the data via report fields to page footer. And so the problem with counting rows is you need to avoid having a field grow and take another line in the report. It still counts as one row. So that property
I always found counting rows like a last alternative, right?
Right. I saw one customer did it one time, and sure enough, the field grew and threw the document off. So it's probably better to use your page footer.
Mm-hmm. If possible.
Now, there are some things that we have to work around them. Microsoft believes page headers and page footers, no matter which software product you're using, should not have data in them, so they don't treat it very kindly. So let's say you have a sales invoice header that has 20 lines in the header, and when they print to page 2, they don't want to repeat those lines. Headers don't shrink. If a header's 5 inches or 10 centimeters, whatever, it's basically going to be that every time. The same thing applies to page footer. So if you want the top of the document to have fields repeated once for the document but not on successive pages, you can't put them in the header or footer because otherwise you just waste the space.
Yeah, and you throw away a lot of paper.
And of course get people mad at you.
Yep.
If you want to do micro moves for positioning, you use the control arrow keys. And I recommend become familiar with the toolbar icons. There are quite a few, and they will vary according to where you are in the report.
What do you mean with control arrow keys? Can you show that?
Sure. You find this is probably not a good example. Yeah, I can do it with this one. So if I hold my control key down,
which we can't see, but we have to trust that you do.
Right, I'm doing control left and moves it just a little bit.
Okay, so this allows you to, and this is more controllable than the mouse.
Right, because unless you're extremely fine-fingered, you'll find this easier to do. If you're fat-fingered like me, use the control keys.
Oh yeah, then our NAV community is getting older, right? So.
I thought I was getting younger, Mark. I'm on the United States retirement plan, as you work till you die.
Exactly.
And that's not a political opinion. This applies to both sides. If you ever want a little bit of humor, watch George Carlin tell you that there's a club and we're not members of it. A little bit of vulgarity, but he makes the point. Rectangles are useful for grouping text boxes, especially outside of your tablets area. They can also put rectangles inside a box if you want to, and that could be useful if you have somebody who wants you to do something strange. I could actually insert a rectangle, and then I can go ahead and add fields inside the rectangle. So if you ever have to do any weird stuff in terms of a tablet style report, just remember it doesn't rectangles. You can actually insert fields within fields, and the rectangle's good because you can put fields inside the rectangle.
But customers never ask weird stuff, Dave. Come on.
Never ever. Because a lot of them are going towards Power BI, so I have noticed doing less custom reports than I used to, but it's still a big demand for people upgrading from old versions.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to repeat on every page. Report image. If an image varies to where you can't just put it in one time, and this is a little trick I picked up a while ago, and this probably, I'll cover it quickly, but you can get this from point 16 in the Word document, is you can do an image external, and then basically give it the picture location, and you can store this at a UNC location that's accessible to your client. And basically the client is, when it processes this, it will pick up the image from here. Like this example was from Responsibility Center, that you might want to do an item picture or anything else. So this way lets you have a report with lots of pictures without blowing up the RDLC. But just make sure you have your permissions set properly, and of course use at UNC. And so if you want to experiment around with this, just go back, bring up the Word document. And over WAN, large reports will be slow since it has pass over the data set, so that's another important reason for summarizing. And in case you've got the inventory valuation report 10139, was fixed, I think in NAV 2015, but 13 and 13R2 both had the non-summarized versions.
And how hard would it be to like downgrade one of those fixes from newer versions to 2013? Can you just export it to a text, or is the RDLC just too different?
I think 13R2 let you use 2013, but you could try doing it. I think the RDLC, you have to remember the RDLC is partly Visual Studio report viewer and partly nav rendering it. So you could try exporting text and importing. I did have to customize this before they came up with this version, and it takes a little bit of work because it's not as obvious as it looks. So you could definitely try downsizing it. If not, just copy the code. I've found that text files from new versions most of the time will import to older versions. Not too old. I think 2009 I killed the client when I tried that one time, but
poor client.
When I say client, I mean my nav client, not the customer.
not the customer, yeah, exactly. Oops.
You want something really hairy is move your pages into version 4 version running in 2009.
Oh, okay.
So
never tried that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's doable, but okay, queries I mentioned. Queries are great if you have a report that's slow. I had one customer tell me not to upgrade a report because it took half an hour to run, or an hour to run, I forget which, but I had already done it by the time he told me not to do it, and it only took a minute using a nav query.
Yeah, queries are great.
So, now one word of caution, I've run into this with someone with a highly customized invoice form, the nav email logic in 2016, and I would think this probably applies 17, looks at the first data set table, and if it's an integer table, you have to do some custom logic in order for it to work.
Okay.
So, okay, help about this report. Let me show this to you quickly. Still have this. Okay, help about the support. Anyone who's done help about and tried to get the lines realizes the first time around doesn't work. So if I do this from the request box and do help about this page, even though I don't care about it, now if I do my preview, I can do help about this report, and it works the first time.
Yep. And after you activate it, it works during your session, right?
Right. It just has to know the first time you run it in your session. So help about this page triggers it so you don't have to run it twice. The other thing is this particular report, I had my parameters, and you notice they don't show up in the data set. So basically, the data I'm repeating row by row is only the columns that are not marked as parameters. So that keeps your data set smaller.
Yeah. The only issue with using the labels is again translation, right? It only sends the language to the report that the user is currently using.
Yeah. So if you so if you are having to do the report for people with other languages, then yeah, you need to do it the other way.
Yeah.
Because we could be like one of these science fiction movies where everyone speaks English.
And by magic, everybody understands each other.
Yeah. Okay. The port code is a fairly complete set of VBA used by Excel and Access. It's not 100% complete, but includes far more code than shown in the help. I do recommend only using when necessary to keep the ports maintainable, because most people are going to want to see any business logic in Nav, not in Visual Studio. The other thing with the report is set your left and right margins if people can be using hard copies. If you use a PDF, PDFs don't mind a zero right margin, but the printer will cut off the right side of the report. So basically, in your report properties, and I customize my template so it wouldn't be zero, as I set what I want my margins to be, so they will print on regular paper. So remember, if someone wants to print something, a report, you always need to test printing it to paper, because viewing it, even when you review as report layout or save as PDF, is not going to be the same as actual printing. The code, generally if I have to do anything in the code, I just copy and paste to Notepad, modify it there and pull it back. This is all your standard nav code comes across, and this is where your get data and set data goes. I've not seen anything using references or variables. If you get blank pages or incomplete pages between every page, it's probably caused by the report not fitting in the actual page, even if the page is blank. So for example, if I made this bigger, even though this is all blank space, it would basically consume a blank page. So if you're finding that you're getting blank pages, or basically make sure you get rid of any blank space, and that can occur by accident if you're manipulating fields too. So
yeah, I've seen this question on Mibuso a number of times. Help, I have blank pages. And I think it happens as well if you put a letter report from the US into a Dutch database, because letter is wider than A4.
Yeah, that's one thing. I don't know how we all ended up at different paper sizes, but
oh, not all of us, just the US.
You're telling me that US isn't the standard for everybody? One of the few holdouts for feet and inches.
Oh yeah, and Fahrenheit.
Anyway, I imagine saying my weight in kilos is a lot more attractive than pounds.
Yep.
Okay, original nav reports were converted very badly from the classic report counterparts. Every column in the classic report became a field in the data set, and sometimes you had fields duplicated by adding extra underscore characters. So some of the earlier reports are very hard to read, and if you upgrade a custom report that's based upon a standard report, it's going to be a mess. This is where the document outline helps. Also, if you are upgrading a custom report, if it's based on a nav standard report, upgrade the new standard report instead. It's going to be much, much better. So if you have a custom invoice report that's really just some mods to the nav standard, go get the current one and modify that instead. And another little tip, if you want to be really nice to people, put in your documentation trigger, this was derived from report 206, and that way people don't have to try and find it, because some reports aren't that obvious.
Nope.
And I guess my editorial comment that that for reasons that made no sense in 2009, they just basically generated the data sets rather than having a separate data set. So we all live and learn. 2009 was an alpha release of well-tailored, and by R2 it ran semi-decently, but a lot of technical issues.
Oh, but we have that all the time. We had that with SQL Server, we had that with extensions, so why not with RTC, right?
That's right. Yeah, as a side, an interesting experience trying to get charge logic notifications to work as an extension in an Azure SQL Server. The simple answer there is don't install the extension. Now, hopefully 2.0 is going to work in Azure SQL Server without pulling databases back and forth, but version 1, I'd say
just skip it.
Just skip it.
Yeah.
And of course, you can all this whole report is in text. It's much like your nav, so you can export everything to text and edit things there if you get desperate. But as I pointed out, nav 2017 report 206 still does not use captions. Now maybe they do it because it's worldwide, as Mike pointed out, and you want it to be in the language of the user.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, nav 2013 is the only version that will upgrade reports. That gives you the new data set based upon what was in 2009. So if you look at the last property on each field, it's going to have a data set name, and that basically uses that to give you a new data set, and also translates the classic report layout into an RDLC layout. If it's very, very simple, like a row and column, nothing fancy, it's actually usable with some slight mods. If it's complicated, delete it and start over. And if any of you companies that do work in Europe, based in Europe, doing work for US companies, always get the new US version of the report. Don't try and upgrade custom report, check reports, for example. That's just a terrible mess. And I speak from experience. Report conversion, you need to remove direct form references in code. They will not convert. You'll get errors. And that happens a lot in request pages because in 2009, form meant either form or page, depending on the context. Well, in 2013 and above, a form is invalid. It has to be page.
Yeah, if you want to work around that, you can actually use the page transformation tool. If you run the page transformation tool with a report, it would actually change form to page.
Okay.
That's a workaround if you want to do that.
Mm-hmm. Good. Then once it's compiled in 2013, you can import it into the current version of nav you're working with. So if you're doing an upgrade, what I always do is you have to go through the 2013 build step. I then back up my database and carry on with my conversion, and then I restore the 2013 later if I need to do any type of upgrades on any objects.
Yep.
And you can import text files for XML ports, tables, and code units. There are a few changes in XML ports, but I have actually imported 2009 XML ports into 2016 and tweaked them a bit. I actually was importing the text and made a few tweaks and got it to work. Basic list reports. You use the tablets and select your data set. You have your document style reports, use the group header report. Save as PDF, you can do that in code. In Classic, you generally had to use utility, but now in the new version, you have report.save as PDF.
Yeah, this eliminates a lot of custom code in Code Unit 1, typically.
Right. And interactive reports, which I won't have time to cover now. I don't know if we want to do a follow-up, but basically, you can add links to pages and other reports, websites, and use the document index left area to do a preview version of the report.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that when RDLC came out, which is almost 10 years ago, Power BI didn't exist, and Microsoft tried to use RDLC for BI purposes as well. And my humble opinion would be that this is mostly replaced now with Power BI, right?
Right. Yeah, and so the demand I've seen for a lot of the custom reports has gone down considerably. Okay, I'm going to show you a quick example of a matrix report. This is the account schedule, and this is actually in the new version of NAV is used for North American as well as worldwide. So Microsoft's been trying to eliminate some of the customizations for countries where they can. So what a matrix report is, and this is a useful report, it actually repeats cells. So what this is doing with this little curvy horizontal bracket is it's going to repeat that cell for every occurrence. So it actually does a grouping for you by the row number and description. This report without formatting in a 8.5 by 11 format would, I think, do 6 columns, but there's actually no limitation. If you wanted to have an account schedule that you probably fit 8 columns in a page with a little bit of formatting. If you wanted to go unlimited columns on your account schedule, you would be stuck with viewing it or exporting it to Excel. But the account schedule, as it works out of the box, does not have a limitation on the number of columns. And because all your logic's in place for building the account schedule, even with Power BI, it could still be pretty useful to you. So if you want a good example of matrix report, look at the account schedule. And just remember that when you do a matrix report, you give it the fields that aren't changing, and then you give it the cell that you want repeated, and automatically groups it for you. I think I had one other report, label reports. So it'd show you 50,000. Got this trick from somebody else a few years ago, so unfortunately I can't share his name, but NAV, if you look at the standard label reports from NAV, they are very clunky. Visual Studio actually lets you do your repetition. So over here, I actually define a single layer, label the number of columns that play with it in order not to expand over a page. But you see in the report, I'm doing a 4-column report. So basically, I'm doing my labels 4 up. If you look at the examples in NAV, typically they repeat the data set a number of times. Over here, you notice I have a nice simple data set. All it has is I'm doing one on the stock keeping unit. I've got my item picture. and I've just got it defined once, and then I use Visual Studio to handle the multiple columns. So I've included this in my objects, so I have both the file and the text if you want to take a look at it. And I guess Mark will have links in the YouTube, right?
Yep.
So I won't cover that in more detail. I think it's fairly obvious when you look at it, and if you have questions, obviously put them in the comments, and I can respond to that. I think are we about at an hour now, Mark?
I think so. I think we should start wrapping up.
Yeah,
I can do some editing and make it a bit shorter, but it's also the end of my working day, so we should wrap up.
Right. So I had a brief mention about word reports. I'm not going to cover how to do them now, but basically, I feel that in addition to the examples Microsoft gives, they're useful for legal style documents. So if you have a customer who wants to do legal documents, you actually can use word style reports with the XML mapping pane, where you go into Word, do your developer pane, and actually pushes them back and forth. If anyone's interested, we'd probably do a separate session on words, either myself or somebody else. But it's
and next year we also have our Developer 101 series, so maybe you can do one or two webinars as part of that series on reports and cover this kind of stuff.
Sure, glad to. All right, so basically I've covered a lot of things very quickly. Hopefully things that someone new to reports can get value out of, and people maybe been doing it for a while have maybe refreshed their memory on some of the items.
Yep, I think there's definitely stuff for everybody here. I certainly picked up a lot of things. My favorite takeaway from this webinar is definitely the line numbers in the get header and set header, and also the first tip that you shared by using the document outline. I think not having to work with these expressions is just going to make life so much easier. So with that, I think we should end the webinar, and hopefully we will see you with one of the future webinars or at one of the real events this fall. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, you can stop the recording now.